Thank you very much, Dr. Lina, for those wonderful words and welcome. Always nice to work with you. And thank you very much to Amity University for this opportunity. Students out there, welcome to you all from my side as well. I'm going to take you through this webinar, basically three main sections for you to follow, just to make it a little bit easier to follow it as we go along. I'm going to do a little bit of an introduction, just around some pivotal questions regarding the economy and COVID-19. And then, as Dr. Lina mentioned, I specialize in strategic thinking and systems thinking. In a nutshell, if you ask me what I do, besides all the qualifications and everything else that she mentioned, I get people to think differently about things. I have done a lot of work in the field of thought paradigm evolution, and I fundamentally believe that the reason why many a times we are so challenged with the kind of pandemic that we have at the moment is we as people struggle a little bit to think differently about things. So I'm going to take you through a little bit of a journey on how we think about things, but they focus that specifically on strategy and leadership. What is it that shapes our strategic thinking, and what is it that shapes CEOs and leaders across the world? What shapes their thinking? And then in the final instance, end with some recommendations about how I think we need to change our thinking. So that in a nutshell is the structure for this afternoon's webinar. I'm going to try and entertain you for about 40 minutes still, and then we'll leave the last 15 minutes for some Q&A. So if you have some questions as we go along, please save your questions for the end of the session, and I'll be more than happy to answer them then. Okay, so without bombarding you with too much statistics, I think it's fairly obvious that Corona has really put a stick in the spoke of the economic wheels globally. So the question, of course, is when we get out of this, if we get out of this, and how we are going to get out of this, whether things will fundamentally change. Will there be fundamental changes in our economic systems? And before you as a knee-jerk immediately say, yeah, of course it will change, I'm going to show you a couple of occasions where we had dramatic, huge changes on a global scale or huge disruptions on a global scale, and then somehow or another, for some reason, we don't really change. We kind of fall back to what is known as normal. So still a serious question. Will there be new economic realities? And more specifically, will there be new economic systems? Are we going to adjust the scales? And are we going to try and narrow and decrease the gap between the have and the have-nots? Something that we measure through a Gini coefficient, which is an indicator of wealth and wealth distribution throughout the world. Currently, as it stands, the latest research that we have received indicates that the gains that we have made on eradicating poverty has been set back with as much as 30 years, 30. That's 3 generations, ladies and gentlemen. That's a lot. So these are the kind of challenges that we face. And the question is, can we, by continuing the way that we used to continue before Corona, can we continue like that afterwards? Or do we need to look at new models of leadership? Do leaders fundamentally need to change the way in which they lead organizations? Do we need to think about strategy differently? Do we need to investigate the way in which we are scanning the environment currently? Is there something that we're missing? To ultimately deal with economic fragility. Now, what is economic fragility? If I had to explain it to a 4-year-old, I would basically say that economic fragility refers to an economy that can break easily. So yes, it's very big. In terms of GDP growth, it's phenomenal over the decades how we've grown. But what Corona has illustrated is that it's actually fairly weak because you have a pandemic that literally stops these massive engines of production and economic growth. And the question is, what's the takeaway for leaders? How do I need to think about this if I'm a leader, if I'm operating in an environment? Because a lot of times, as you know, you want to go into a new country or you want to expand your business. One of the things that you do is you look at the economic forecast and you look at, is the economy strong in that country? You look at whether the economy is growing. And yet, you might take that decision thinking that the economy is strong, whatever that means, and then a pandemic comes along and shows us exactly how fragile it is. and with a week or two's seizure of economic activity, the economy breaks. So that's what we mean when we talk about economic fragility. Now, why is that a big question? Working with the McKinsey Institute, these are some of the things that we look at to try and find answers for. Why is it such a big issue that the economy is fragile? Is it not simple? Can we not simply just pick up again where we've left off? Before the pandemic, people talk about the so-called, and you might have heard it in the news and on social media, very popular phrase. They talk about a V-shaped recovery, and a V-shaped recovery literally talks about something that's shaped like a V, and it tries to indicate an economy that drops sharply, but that spikes again equally as sharp. We are long gone past the stages of a V-shaped recovery. In the early days, and I'm talking about early days of Corona, 2, 3, 4 months ago, WHO and also the Economic Development Forum globally said, well, we're probably looking at a V-shaped recovery. And I think personally they probably shared that because they don't want to make people uncomfortable or create a panic too soon if it's not really necessary. So you're kind of saying to people, yeah, there's a problem, but don't worry, we're going to recover quickly. By now, most economists would tell you that we're not looking at a V-shaped recovery. We have two options. The one is a W-shaped recovery, which means that we have a sharp drop, a slight lift, but then there is the chances of a reoccurring second pandemic, a second breakout of Corona, which means we'll drop again and only then peak. All in all, we're probably looking at what we call an L-shaped recovery. So it's an off-the-cliff fall and then a very long, slow route back to recovery. Truth be told, we can project, we can throw these things into computers and artificial intelligence systems, but we don't really know. Because Corona is not something you can see with a blind eye. Corona has got 3 different strains. Corona in some parts of the world kills people much more rapidly than in other parts. And Corona is not something that you do a simple test, like if I'm a smoker, for instance, and my life insurance policy broker wants to test whether I smoke. He takes some of my blood, they add something to the blood, and the test is very clear. It tells you have nicotine in your blood or not. It's almost like a color-coded test. When it comes to Corona, it doesn't work like that. I don't know how many of you work closely with Corona, but Corona is something in terms of the test that is interpreted by the human being, the expert. So Corona works on a graph. When they get the results of the test, the graph has a certain type of movement, a certain shape. And based on the shape, the person that looks at the result can make the deduction that the person is either positive or negative. Now, why am I sharing that with you? I'm sharing that with you because I don't want you to have the illusion that we are on top of this thing. Right now, some of the labs have uncovered areas where there's a possible mutation of the virus, which means the kind of information that comes from the graph changes. So it's fluid. And in that fluidity, it's becoming more and more difficult for the experts, microbiologists, pathologists, doctors that work with this to actually clearly and without a doubt indicate whether this is a positive or negative case. So still a lot of uncertainty. And I'm not bringing you doom and gloom, but it's also not my job to bring you false hope. It's my job to challenge you to think differently. Because what is at stake here is not just lives, however terrible that may sound. For the business leader, for the societal leader, for governments, for the economist, for the everyday man and woman on the street, with families to feed. It's a question of livelihoods. That's what makes this so challenging. If we do not stop the virus, many people will die. We know that. If our attempts to stop the pandemic severely damages our economies, it's hard to envision how there will be even more suffering ahead. So it's a question of balancing lives and livelihoods. Looking at it differently, it would appear to look like this. So here on the top left-hand corner, I have imperative 1, which is to safeguard lives. And this is just one of the scenarios that we're working with. This information, again, provided by McKinsey. Analysis in partnership with Oxford Economics. So let's say imperative number one is to safeguard lives. What you have is you have immediate lockdown. So there you can see a very sharp increase in the case count, and then it drops sharply as governments put societies in lockdown. And you kind of have a flattening of the case count. The reason why they do that is because they want to slow an overrun on health and social services. And also because they have as imperative to save lives. And then it flattens out. However, by the same token, imperative two is to safeguard livelihoods. In other words, to not break the economy so bad that it's almost impossible to recover, and in the process put millions of people out of jobs and physically in a position where they are starving. So you have slow GDP growth there, quite a dramatic fall, and then a very slow recovery. And that's the L-shaped recovery that I referred to earlier on. So this is the question that we have. Now, for us to try and answer the question, how to deal with this, we need to be very clear on the extent of the damage, the economic damage that the COVID pandemic is creating at the moment. And one can say, look, it's not really the virus, it's more how governments reacting to it. Yeah, be that as it may, we are in the situation that we are in partly because of the pandemic. Now let's look at, by means of comparison, the kind of damage that we are in created by this pandemic. The first one, I just want to make a brief comparison between the decline in the economy of the Americas during the Second World War, the impact really on the economy, and Corona. So the impact on creating a retraction of the economy of the pandemic is actually worse than what it was during World War II. Closer home and more recent, most of you, I would imagine, can probably recall the problems that we had in 2007, 2008. 2007, 2008, we had a so-called liquidity crisis, which basically means that we didn't have enough money to service the debts that we had on a global scale. And that led to a surge in liquidations, companies go out of business, people not being able to service their loans, their mortgages. Basically, they borrowed money against assets, and the value of those assets dropped significantly, and the money that they were supposed to get to bail them out of their debt scenario was not available. So it was a severely bad impact from an economic perspective. And that's the yellow line here that you can see running across this graph here at the bottom. We also had China's currency devaluation, which was not that bad that you see during 2015. And then a huge emerging market sell-off in 2018, you'll find over there, where people were shifting their funds and their savings to more secure locations. Now, the pandemic, here's the red line. You probably guessed that by now. Now look at the massive gap between the red line here and the yellow line. So the thing that comes, the trend, the event that comes closest to causing the kind of economic disruption that the pandemic is causing, that would be the 2007-2008 global financial crisis. And as you can clearly see by means of this graph, the impact of the pandemic so much more. All right, so that's why I said I don't think I need to spend too much time to tell you how bad the punch is that landed in the economy's face. The question is, in terms of how we think, the question is, how did we end up here? How did we end up in a situation where in 2003, the total export in dollars from China was only $438 billion. And in 2018, a mere 15 years later, it's almost 5 times that amount. Okay, so pandemic aside, how did we end up creating an economic model, an economic system, where globally One country single-handedly handles about 87% of all manufactured white appliances and households. White appliances being things like fridge, TVs, microwaves, stoves, things like that. What happened? How did we think? What created this imbalance where we have single source supply from one country in particular? And that's where, by the looks of things, in terms of the research, the pandemic started from, or the virus was first contracted and then spread globally. The rest is history. But let's look at why we created this kind of a imbalance in our economic system. So for that, we need to look at how we think as people and as leaders, all right? For that, I need to give you a little bit of a lesson in strategy, okay? Now, when we look at strategy, we have as a driver a profit margin, a profit motive, okay? So the economy and political systems are partially or fully controlled by private owners for profit. And there's two ways in which I can generate that profit. One here on the right-hand side, this slide was shared to me by Professor Felix Weber-Olsagi from Harvard Business School as well. You look here, the top part, it talks about price and willingness to pay. Now, what's the difference between the two? The difference is the price is what you pay for things. The willingness to pay is what you as a customer is actually willing to pay for it. So if I take myself as an example, I really like donuts. I think I kind of like it too much, meaning it's not all that good for your health, but I really like it. So some mornings I stop at local Zoom, which is about 300 meters from my house. I buy a freshly baked donut and I pay about 3 dirhams for it. If I get to the Zoom and they don't have donuts, they sold out, I will continue driving and I will find the first possible garage, workshop, or petrol filling station where I can pull off, and there's also a Zoom, and I will see whether they have it. And if I then find it, even if that donut then costs me 6 dirham, it doesn't mind. It doesn't matter. I'm going to buy it. So I'm willing to pay more for it. So companies pick up on this, and they create some kind of a value contribution in that upper tier space. So the Zoom where I say, learn that Steyn really likes his donuts, so they start to deliver it to my house, for instance. And for that value-added service, Steyn is willing to pay more. That's one way in which I can increase profit. The other way is here, by cost of inputs, willingness to sell. That's by reducing cost of labor, cost of rent, cost of my employees. And between the two, the lower one is much easier because the value creation means that I need to know customers and I need to know consumers very, very well. And they change and chop and change all the time. So the easier solution is to focus on the cost of inputs and just simply make that as little as possible. So that brought about through the decades what we call mechanistic thinking. Here's your organizational strategy and here's environmental change. And when you have a stable environment, the organizational strategy can easily plan into the future because there's an assumption that tomorrow will look the same as yesterday. So I do scanning, scenario planning, I select my strategy, I build my structure, I implement, and I forecast. However, during times of pandemic or any other disruption like the global financial crisis, you find that the environmental change in terms of the type of change, the extremity of the change, and the pace of the change, it moves too fast for organizations, and organizations try to play catch-up all the time. And that's referred to complexity. And in this space, leaders don't operate that well as in that space. As a matter of fact, not just leaders, we as normal human beings as well. I'll prove it to you just now by playing a little game with you. But very quickly, back to the kind of states that we find when it comes to decision making. There's chaotic, there's simple, there's complicated and complex. Chaotic is my house is on fire, I have to act immediately, and I run out of the house. Afterwards, I sense and I respond, kind of what happened. Simple is a stable environment. I sense, I categorize politics, economy, social trend changes, I scan the environment, I build my strategy. Complicated means it's very difficult, but it's still static. Complex is the difficult one. It's where things move and change all the time, like we have now was corona. Then the information is this. Then it seems to peak. Then there's a slowdown. Then there's a new outbreak. So we find ourselves in this zone here, which is a combination between chaotic and complex. And we call that the unordered state. And the human brain, just by default, is not very good to operate there. Why? Well, because our thinking ability is guided by what appears to be more comfortable for us. Let me illustrate that by this game. Now, I want you to do something for me on the other side, okay? I'm going to show you the slide that you very briefly saw now with the numbers on. And I want you to find the number 1, and then I want you to see how far you can count in sequence. So find the 1, find the 2, find the 3, okay? I'm going to give you 10 seconds exactly for that. Ready? 3, 2, 1, start. All right, stop. Now, I want you to type in by the chat box, just set your settings so it shows all participants. Just want you to type in how much, up to where you counted, 3, 4, 5, whatever the case might be. I might need some help from my technical team because I'm not seeing the chats.
I'm able to see, Dr. So I got a response from Mr. Venkat. He says that he can see 12.
Okay, so then
And there is a student called Newman, and he could see 5.
Here we go. Okay, I see 5, all right. Okay, people, type. How far did you get? Everyone, please type. 8, type. Fast, we haven't got a lot of time. I only have 2 responses, 5 and 8. Please type. Please, ladies and gentlemen, I have 55 attendees. Please type how far you got counting. 7.
7, 9.
9.
7 and 9.
Okay. Maybe the rest of you didn't follow when I asked about the exercise.
Yes.
So we're going to do it again. Okay, so everybody pay attention, please. I'm going to show you a slide with random numbers on it. I want you to find number 1 and then count in sequence 1, 2, 3 and see how far you get. And remember how far you got, okay? Ready? You have 10 seconds. 10, 3, 2, 1, go. All right, now type how far you got for me, please. Please type in the type box. 5. Type people should go a lot quicker. Just type to the number that you got. 3.
So there are a lot of people together. I think 5, 22, 41, 18, 17, 5, 9, 7, 5.
All right. Okay. All right. Now, remember what I'm saying is I'm trying to help you to answer the question of why we ended up here. And I have a hypothesis, and that is that the reason why we ended up here is when it comes to strategy, we have 2 ways in which we can increase profit, either through customer intelligence or through cost cutting. Cost cutting is the easier one. Why? Well, because we operate better in an ordered state than an unordered state. Let me prove it to you. I want you to do exactly the same exercise again. Please count, find the 1, and see how far you can get. But this time, I'm going to put a structure over the numbers. 3, 2, 1, start. All right. Please type in to how far you got this time. 13. 3, 6, 9, 5.
Student which was on 5 went till 13.
Yeah.
That's an
11.
interesting.
Yeah. So you would experience that all of you that counted when the slide was random like this, you got fairly low scores. But once you put a structure on it, like Rick is saying here, immediately you can see that there's a structure. There's 1, 2, and now you're starting to understand that it follows a sequence in the blocks. So the randomness, the background is still complex, but the minute I put a structure on it, it's seemingly easier for my brain to function with that. And it's exactly the same with strategy. If we look at the development of strategy over the past 7 decades, we go back to World War II, after World War II, strategy leaders, CEOs, MDs, kind of led their organizations almost in a general-like style of management and leadership. And you had a whole lot of structured frameworks that was developed in that time. Humphrey from, I think it was Stanford or Harvard, I can't remember. He gave us SWOT, whereby you take something that's very complicated and complex and you categorize it, you segment it. After that, Aquila gave us PEST or PESTLE, where I take the environment and I break it into politics, economy, social systems, technology. I segment and I categorize. I basically take this mess and I place a structure over it, and that makes it possible for me to make sense out of it. Porter, in the late 1970s, gave us 5 forces: suppliers, buyers, new entrants, substitute products, and existing rivalry. All of these frameworks helped us to deal in an environment that was actually very complex, but kind of made it simple until globalization happened. The Berlin Wall fell at the end of the 1980s, and we moved straight into globalization with the rise of the information era. Internet made it possible to grow our businesses across borders, across the globe. And there was a very positive correlation between globalization and success in my business and this connectedness that we had the ability of almost, all the way up to the 4th Industrial Revolution where we find ourselves today. So you could see that evolution, but we still primarily prefer to operate in this strategic mode whereby we try to structure and contain and fix costs. We're not very fond of the top one. Not that there's not organizations that play there, but the ordered one, the more ordered, simpler one, is this approach here, the one at the bottom. So what you had is you had business schools globally teaching CEOs, MDs all across the world. Even today, if I look at business schools curriculum, I still teach on the MBA level for 4 different international business schools. You look at their curriculum, when it comes to internationalization and globalization, they would all tell you have to scale your business. What does it mean? Get more customers and produce more products and try to make the labor component as cheap as possible. So that's what we've been taught. And that's the state that we operate within. So what you had is you had multinational organizations, growth in size and in number through scaling, resource diversification, but ultimately taking advantage of the imbalances in international labor, practices, and associated costs, which lead us to the following statement. Many people look at China and wants to blame China for the problem we have at the moment. But let me state this categorically. China did not create China. The world created China with our strategic thinking approach that has forced companies and led companies to select and prefer a low-cost source for supply. And obviously, because China is a place where labor is very cheap, that's where most people, most companies took their manufacturing. And that is why we ended up in this model where we have this imbalance between where products are being manufactured and where we are sending them to. So the question now is, what now? I give you this snippet from a LinkedIn post. I think I did it yesterday. This is what we are challenging business leaders with, and this is what I want to challenge you as students with. What a wonderful time to be a student in this time. You have this live case study of human behavior, this big social experiment. How are we going to get out of this? Are we going to work together? Are we going to work against one another? Are rich countries going to be better off than poorer countries? Fantastic case study for research and learning that can come out of this. But here's something that I want you to consider. I want you to throw away the word normal. People talk about, in 3 months' time, when things peak, we're going to go back to normal. Or they even talk about the new normal. Now, the thing is, by definition, normal implies, as I say in the post there, something that's expected, something that is usual, or something that's typical. It gives you a false sense of security to think, yeah, things will normalize again. We were going to go back to normal, or we're going to create a new normal. Right now, based on the explanation I gave to you when we started this afternoon's discussion, normal is not something that's even on the horizon. It shouldn't be a part of the jargon. What we should be asking ourselves, as opposed to going back or a new normal, is how are we going to live with the virus? Now, why do I say that? I say that because the economic cost on livelihoods at this stage is starting to outweigh the benefits of the lockdowns and the regulations that we have in place to just focus on imperative one. Difficult choice that we have to make here. How can we live with it? And the reason why we put this question to you is not, I didn't come up with a hypothesis. Einstein, many years ago, said, sorry, that's a mistake. It should be 18, not 19. It looks like he passed away before he was born. My mistake. It's 1879. But he said the world, as we have created it, is a process of our thinking. And it cannot be changed without changing our thinking. So therefore, by deduction, our hypothesis is that economic fragility is not a function of disruption. It's not a function of COVID. Economic fragility is a function of how we have shaped our economic models and systems based on how we think, as I've just explained to you in this very structured manner. Here's an example to prove my point. In the 1970s, we had two oil crises, 73, 79. In both cases, oil prices skyrocketed, putting a lot of pressure on a lot of economies, internationally, globally. There was hardly any substitute source of electricity or energy that was investigated post 73 and 79. Worldwide, the world kind of took a step back, slowed down, started to use less of fuel, and put all sorts of restrictions in place until when? Until we moved back to so-called normal. Was what we should have done. We should have come up with new innovative ways of dealing with the energy crisis and not be so stuck in the mode of, well, there's only oil, so, let's wait until things normalize again. For you as business leaders, for your students in strategy, you have to make a fundamental shift in terms when it comes to corona and it comes to pandemic. We do not have the luxury at this stage of a stable environment. We do not have luxury whereby tomorrow will be a continuation of yesterday. It chops and changes all the time. Now, when you regard strategy and strategy only as the primary building block of sustainable competitiveness, you need a stable environment. You need a structured environment so that you can go through the steps of strategy as it's indicated there. What is your winning aspiration? Where will we play? Which part of the world? Are we going to be cloud or platform-based? How will we win? Through cost or value add, speed of delivery, best taste, or whatever the case might be. And here, the bottom part, we set up our structures and we apply our resources. So it's a fairly simple process by the looks of things. Except if that canvas shakes, it's very, very difficult to stay on the right track. So what we are challenging students and business leaders with is to shift from strategy as the primary building block to business model flexibility. Now, again, this is not all that new. 2007, 2009 saw an article that was published by Casadeses Massanel from Harvard Business School where he spoke about this and proclaimed at the time that the new primary building block for competitiveness, specifically sustainable competitiveness, is business model flexibility. So what is business model flexibility? Here, I try to illustrate it through this triangle there on the left-hand side of the screen. Strategy has a function, okay? It sets direction, it crafts the vision, it gives the mission, but it's limited in its ability. Why? Well, because strategy is only a plan. Even Peter Drucker, the late Peter Drucker, said that the world's best strategy, not implemented, is still a poor strategy. So yes, strategy is important, but it's limited in terms of its ability. The business model, that middle section there, refers to what I call the physical logic. The physical logic of how a company creates, delivers, and captures value, taken from Ungerer and from Osterwalder. So in other words, where's my head office? Am I close to my suppliers, near to my suppliers, close to customers? Where is my cold storage? The physical logic, how I design that. Now, if you think of the imbalance that we have with 87% of white goods being produced in China, being shipped to the rest of the world in a very eco-unfriendly manner, might I add, it's not a very flexible business model. As we could see now, companies that started to suffer first were companies that were dependent upon products from China. They didn't have an alternative. So not a lot of flexibility in that business model. Whereas if they would spread and divide their supply from different points of the globe, the disruption wouldn't have been that bad in the beginning. The operating architecture, of course, that just simply refers to the doing part of the organization. But the competitiveness lies there. I've got to make that as flexible as possible. And as the environment changed, I've got to have various options that I can look at. So the four main options that we're asking business leaders and students like yourself to consider is where we are now. There's a couple of things that business leaders need to consider. Either based on the extent of business model disruption, you need to shift your business model, or you need to shape a new business. And here's where our thinking needs to change. How are we generating profit? Should we follow this specific system, this methodology, this approach in terms of profit generation? Should profit motive still be the primary consideration for an organization? Should we look at reinventing the shape of our business, or an option of sustaining your business and restoring operations? Do I just take a breather, like a university at the end, for instance? A university is shifting their business model from in-class to online. But at the same time, they're sustaining the operations. They try to restore it. They try to keep the momentum going in the hope that we will have on-campus training again, as an example. In some instances, restructuring of the company and of the industry is a requirement. So those are the kind of things that we're challenging business leaders with that I wanted to share with you today. We were very, and I can share this with the students, Dr. Lena. We published an article on this platform for connected leadership framework. It's a framework, and it was published in HBR Arabia about a month ago. Myself and Dr. One, of my colleague in the business, we wrote this article whereby we're trying to provide a framework to business leaders across the globe which will allow them to build this level of flexibility into their business model. So there, the top side, you can see it's a question of thinking differently, learning from one another, acting, implementing, making the changes, and inspiring for greatness. Because how do we keep people motivated? How do we keep on inspiring for a better tomorrow if we have this fluidity and this disruption, this extreme disruption in our environment at the moment? There's 5 levels that we look at. We look at the self for purposes of reflection, reflecting on yourself, becoming more aware of what you can and what you cannot. Leading your team through building relationships on a whole new level at this stage, being all virtual, all in the cloud. Leading organizations through this disruption. And then in the final instance, really urging organizations to become what we call societal leaders, whereby they care more about society. It's not just me, my household. Do I have enough money? Do we have enough food in the house? But it's the society at large. What can we do to curb the suffering and the damage, the harm that's being caused by this economic slowdown at the moment? So that we can ultimately move into a position where we, together, through sharing, lead the world. That's what the framework focuses on. So I'm happy to share that with the students afterwards. My organization, as Dr. Lena mentioned, Platform for Connected Leadership. You can find us on LinkedIn or anywhere else. Please do connect with us. Feel free to follow us and share our comments. I posted this webinar today with Amity's permission as well. So please do connect. And that's what I very briefly wanted to share with you today. We've got about 16 minutes left, so I'm going to open it up to some questions and some answers now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Stein. And I've been associated with you for, I think, more than 8-9 years. And whenever I hear you, I think you just take to another level of thought process and make us think of something new concept that come to you. I have got questions from a few questions, and one of the questions come from one of our strategic management faculty member, Mr. Venkat, and he's asking us that whether the classic strategic model of Porter, Mintzberg, and others will be relevant moving forward after COVID.
Okay, thank you very much. Excellent question. I get it a lot. So let me start by saying, you know, as a fellow academic, I have obviously a world of respect for the Mintzbergs, the Porters of the world that has put together these kind of thought paradigms and frameworks that we work within. And I'm also strongly associated with Harvard Business School in the region, doing a lot of teaching and learning for them. So with respect to the work that they've done and the frameworks that they have delivered us, it is becoming increasingly more difficult to apply a structure which is not flexible in itself, but requires stability to operate within. So if I have a stable environment, Porter's 5 Forces, Aquilar's Pestle, Humphrey's SWOT, Mintzberg's models, works perfectly well. So the challenge is not necessarily to say, you know, will it still be relevant? The challenge would more be to say, can we still use it? And if we do still use it, in what way do we need to amend the application thereof? Or do we need to come up with something totally different and something totally new? Myself is of the opinion that we have to come up with something different and something new, whereby the models that we work with are more lucid and more fluid so that it can move with the times. Otherwise, what you keep on doing is you keep on trying to take a state of unorder, and you almost in a artificial way force it into an ordered state, which it isn't really. So will it still be applicable? I would say yes, but definitely in an amended form or a total new form. And I think there's huge possibilities and opportunities for students and academia globally to jump in with some serious research on this. The other thing is, if I may just add to why we say we need amended or new models, is strategies planning lifespan has been radically reduced. So in the 60s and the 70s, if I would put together a long-term strategy, I would look at 5, 10, even 20 years. That's no longer the case for two reasons. In Porter's model, he talks about substitute products and new entrants. Now, if you look at a substitute product or a new entrant today, they don't look like existing rivalry anymore. So if I take an Uber as an example, Uber does not look like a conventional taxi association, and yet it is. Airbnb does not look like a new hotel, a tourist group, and yet it is the largest one in the world. So because of the fact that your competition doesn't look like you anymore, it becomes very difficult to use the models that was generated in the 60s and the 70s. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you, Dr. Stein. I have a student asking us a question that, you know, the things are changing, business models are changing, unemployment is on a raise. So the new job opening, how a new entrant as a fresher or an MBA person, what kind of job they are going to land up in the coming future?
Well, I think luckily for students right now, I know that it sounds terrible. Myself, I mean, my son studies in London and he's been stuck there now since December. He was going to come back in March, and I'm in Dubai, and he missed the flight back. And as you know, the country's borders have been changed, locked down. And why I mentioned that is, yes, there's some discomfort for students at the moment globally, but in terms of opportunity and in terms of future jobs, it's actually a very, very exciting time, because the one thing that you can be for sure of is that the opportunities are actually going to be a lot more abundant. And the reason for that is the challenges on a global scale is a lot more. You see, the minute that you have something like a pandemic that hits the world, the way in which it's hitting it at the moment, we also realize our shortcomings. Some countries deal with this very well. Some countries are struggling. So there where you have countries that are struggling, there's opportunities that opens up there in terms of how we can share our IP, our ability, our technology, how we can link what we have to offer in terms of qualification and expertise with countries that do not necessarily have such high levels of qualification and expertise. So as a freshman, your world of work will look totally different. I think the world has finally realized that working from home is actually not such a bad idea. It's more about deliverable than what it is about hours spent at the office. So your world of work will change, and your business models will all fundamentally change and move to a kind of an Amazon, an Uber, and an Airbnb platform kind of organizational structure. Our own organization, it's a platform business. It's known as Platform for Connected Leadership. Now, what does that platform refer to? It refers to a place in the cloud where you can go and you can select a program or course or something, and you take yourself through learning and through teaching. It's a platform business. I don't need an office, bricks and mortar, a glass, a fancy foyer, or a big office. So your world of work will certainly change, and your opportunities will be a lot more. Fundamentals like maths, science, technology, that's still, in terms of the research that we do on a global scale, seem to be the number one necessity. Following shortly with services in health, and then on a global scale, you're looking at areas of opportunity in food security, water security, and then the delivery of basic needs, housing and electricity. So I can't say to you specifically what, but what our research indicates clearly is that, yes, it's all doom and gloom right now, but the opportunities that springs out of this, because as a human race, we realize that we need to work much more closely with one another, is abundant. Students today are going to have a field day with employability. A field day. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you so much. If you have any questions in your chat box, Dr. Stein, can you check, please?
Yes. How will the interest market request? Please let me know if you have. Okay, no, that's you. No, I don't.
Okay. So I have one more question
Sure.
from a student. It says that the virus is an unprecedented event, and the exercise we are about numbers. What relates directly to our way of dealing with events? How you will suggest we change the way we are thinking, function, and deal with this unprecedented event?
Okay, it's a brilliant question. I'm so glad you asked that, because there's something very specific that I need to highlight. Okay. In strategy, we primarily look for trends. Now, what is important in terms of the pandemic is the pandemic is not a trend. Now, follow me on this on this answer. The pandemic is a disruption. Now, what some companies are doing is some companies are making strategic changes based on the disruption. You've got to be very careful and think very long and hard before you do that, because you typically in strategy make changes based on trend changes. So if the world, for instance, if I have a pizza restaurant and there's a new trend that more and more people are ordering from home and not coming to my restaurant, I change my strategy. I change my business model. So I move away from a bricks and mortar, nice kind of atmosphere pizza parlor. I make it smaller. I move out of the very expensive a mall where I'm paying rent into a less expensive industrial area. I make a lot of pizzas, and I employ motorbike delivery people, and I change my model to become fast quality pizza delivery to your home. That's based on a trend. That's the only time that you should make strategic decisions and changes. A disruption is something that you have a short-term tactical response towards. And that's to your question, how should we treat it? There's two things in terms of the globe that we are considering, and that's lives and livelihoods. Let's talk about an organization. Myself, I'm at a university. What should a university do whilst we now have this pandemic? Well, the university has a strategy, and the university has a vision and a mission and a set of values, and that is to deliver high-quality teaching to their students. That priority can't change. That priority shouldn't change. The priority and the goal, the direction of the vision of the university should still be, how can we deliver top-end quality education to our students? The mode of delivery might change, and it might now be online, whilst before it was in a classroom. But I'm not knocking down my campus yet, because this is not a trend. It might be comfortable, it might be convenient for some. Students might think, hey, it's awesome, I can now finally sit at home and eat my chips and drink my Coke and, watch my WhatsApps with the one eye while I gaze at the screen with the other. Yeah, that might be so. And, new generation students like my son, you have the ability to do all of those things and still manage to learn something. But the university is not changing strategy. It's offering an alternative as a short-term tactical solution. So in terms of the pandemic, my recommendation would be, if I could advise on a global scale, we should rather try to live with the virus as opposed to keep ourselves away from the virus. Keeping ourselves away from the virus has the goal of slowing an overrun on health services and social services. But it doesn't necessarily contain contamination. I might have it or not. But the minute that you start to ease lockdown again, the contamination can continue as before. I get on a bus, somebody else gets on a bus, they have it, I get to the office, and there we go. So I would rather impose much stricter regulation in terms of what we wear when we go out. Not just have a mask, but a mask and gloves and maybe even a plastic sheet that covers our entire body and all our clothes. So that we can continue with the economic activity, but try to limit the actual spread of the virus. So from an organizational behavioral point, how people should behave, I would recommend that to try and maintain as much of the economic activity as possible, of course, with no disrespect to the life-threatening nature of this virus. But from a strategic point of view, my advice to organizations is, please, you can try and find trends in this. Maybe if it's prolonged, and they become a trend where students prefer online to campus, then you can start to look at maybe setting up smart, smart studios at the university where you really do the kind of online stuff professionally. But it's not a trend yet. At this stage, it's just a reaction to a pandemic, and you got to get the difference. You got to be able to distinguish between the two. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you, Dr. Stein. I think we are about to close. So thank you, Dr. Stein, for an engaging, informative, and an insightful session, giving us a clear vision of what the current situation is and how the new strategies needs to be formulated. I hope that we get more opportunities to hear from you in the near future. Thank you for your time, and I appreciate from your busy schedule, you took out time just when I asked you for, and really appreciate that. Thanks, Doctor.
Anytime. Thank you for the opportunity, and good luck. Help us to make the world a better future. We all need that. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.